There's something wrong with me now, and it started with a boat ride to nowhere. I need to tell you this story before I lose the ability to tell stories at all. Before the last fragments of who I used to be disappear completely into whatever I'm becoming. My name is Marcus Chen, and until 3 months ago, I was just another urban explorer with a YouTube channel called Forgotten Foundations. Nothing special. 12,000 subscribers who watch me crawl through abandoned hospitals, decode graffiti in derelict subway tunnels, and document the slow decay of civilization's forgotten corners. I wasn't famous. I wasn't reckless. I had an obsession with places that time forgot, spaces where human stories ended abruptly, leaving only questions behind. Every abandoned building was a puzzle, every rusted sign a clue to some larger mystery about how societies rise and fall, how memory works, how the past refuses to stay buried. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried among spam advertisements and collaboration requests from other urban exploration channels. The subject line read, "Ferox Island." They thought they buried it. They didn't. No signature, no profile picture, just a generic Gmail address, deepcurrent@gmail.com. First, I almost deleted it. Anonymous tips were common in my line of work, and most led to nothing more than trespassing charges or wild goose chases. But something about the message's tone made me pause. It wasn't the usual breathless excitement of amateur explorers or the conspiracy-laden rambling of paranoid theorists. This felt different, clinical, purposeful. "Marcus," the email read, "I've been following your work. You understand that abandoned places aren't truly empty. They're repositories of unfinished business. Ferox Island is the kind of place that chooses its visitors. It's been waiting for someone like you, someone who asks the right questions." Attached were GPS coordinates, 41.2847 DN, 69.9383 DN. A location roughly 40 miles off the coast of Massachusetts, in waters that most maritime charts showed as empty ocean. The email continued. During the Cold War, the U.S. military conducted classified bioweapons research on Ferox Island. Official records claim the facility was decommissioned in 1963 following a geological incident. What they don't mention is that the island wasn't evacuated. It was quarantined, then sealed, then forgotten. But geological incidents don't require 40-year security classifications, do they? I spent the next week researching. Public records were sparse, but what I found painted a picture of a facility that existed in bureaucratic limbo. Naval intelligence files mentioned Project Deep Echo, a research initiative focused on acoustic manipulation of biological systems. Defense contractors had billed the government for specialized containment equipment, sound dampening materials, and something called resonance isolation chambers. The more I dug, the more obvious it became that someone had worked very hard to erase Ferox Island from official history. Satellite imagery showed only empty water where the coordinates indicated land should be. Maritime safety bulletins warned of unstable geological conditions in the area, but no geological surveys had been conducted there in decades. Then I found the fisherman. Captain Eddie Moreau operated a small charter service out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. 63 years old, weathered by decades of Atlantic storms, with the kind of deep-set eyes that suggested he'd seen things he preferred not to discuss. When I approached him about a trip to the coordinates, his entire demeanor shifted. "You're not the first to ask about those waters," he said, refusing to meet my gaze, "but you might be the first dumb enough to actually want to go there." He agreed to take me, but only after I paid triple his usual rate and signed a liability waiver that absolved him of responsibility for any consequences arising from passenger contact with restricted maritime zones. The document was oddly specific, as if drafted by someone with intimate knowledge of particular risks. "I'll drop you off," Eddie said as we shook hands, "but I won't set foot on that island. And if you're not back at the pickup point in 48 hours, I'm calling the Coast Guard and telling them you fell overboard. Because, That's what I'll believe happened. The night before departure, Eddie called with a final warning. They said the island was geologically unstable. That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. The ground there, it remembers things, and sometimes it remembers back. I should have asked what he meant. I should have canceled the trip. Instead, I packed my equipment, cameras, audio recorders, emergency supplies, and a satellite phone, and tried to convince myself that whatever secrets Ferox Island held, they were just another story waiting to be told. Looking back now, I realized that the story was never waiting to be told. It was waiting to be lived, and once you start living a story like this, you can never really stop. The morning of departure dawned unnaturally still. The Atlantic, usually restless and gray, stretched ahead like a sheet of black glass. Eddie's boat, the Persistence, cut through waters so calm that it seemed almost solid, leaving behind a wake that disappeared within seconds, as if the ocean were actively erasing evidence of their passage. 30 years I've been fishing these waters, Eddie muttered, adjusting the radio with nervous precision. Never seen it this quiet. It's like the sea is holding its breath. I tried to document the journey, but my camera equipment behaved strangely from the moment we left port. The LCD screen flickered intermittently, displaying fragments of footage I didn't remember recording. Brief glimpses of concrete corridors, rusted machinery, and what appeared to be observation windows thick with condensation. When I checked the memory card, it showed that it was completely empty. 20 miles out, we encountered the first anomaly. A massive bank of fog rolled toward us despite the clear sky, moving with unnatural purpose and speed. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in seconds, and the fog itself seemed to carry a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. "That's not normal," Eddie said, throttling back the engine. "Fog doesn't move like that. It doesn't choose directions." Inside the fog bank, sounds became muffled and distorted. Our voices echoed back with slight delays, as if the mist were processing our words before returning them. The boat's compass began spinning wildly, and the GPS signal cut out entirely. Eddie navigated by instinct, following some internal map that seemed to bypass conventional navigation entirely. When we finally emerged from the fog, Ferox Island lay ahead like a wound in the ocean's surface. The island was larger than I expected, roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide, with a central ridge that rose into jagged peaks. But it was the wrongness of the place that struck me first. The proportions seemed off, as if viewed through a lens that subtly distorted perspective. The shoreline curved in ways that hurt to look at directly, and the vegetation, what little remained, grew in patterns that suggested some organizing principle I couldn't identify. "I'm not going any closer," Eddie announced, dropping anchor about 300 meters from shore. "You take the dinghy. I'll wait here until tomorrow evening. If you're not back by sunset, I'm gone." The dinghy ride to shore was the longest 300 meters of my life. The water beneath me was so clear I could see the bottom, and the bottom was covered in perfectly geometric patterns, like crop circles pressed into the sea floor. Schools of fish moved in rigid formations, never breaking rank, never changing direction. Above, seabirds flew in precise spirals, circling the island endlessly but never landing. The beach itself was composed of black sand that felt warm despite the cool air. Rusted warning signs poked through the sand at regular intervals, their text weathered but still readable. "Anti-solitary personnel only. Biological hazard. Unsecure Unis acoustic phenomena to security immediately." I pulled the dinghy up onto the shore and immediately noticed the silence. No insect sounds, no small animal movements, no rustling of vegetation. Even the waves seemed to lap against the shore more quietly than they should have. It was as if the island itself absorbed sound, creating a pocket of unnatural quiet that made my heartbeat sound thunderous. My first hour on the island was spent mapping the immediate area. A concrete path, cracked but still intact, led from the beach toward the island's interior. Along the way, I discovered the remains of what had once been an extensive facility, collapsed watchtowers, the foundations of barracks, and several intact buildings that stood like monuments to abandonment. The largest structure was clearly the main laboratory complex, a sprawling concrete building with thick walls and narrow windows, now mostly dark. Satellite dishes and radio antennas bristled from its roof, all pointing in different directions as if designed to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously. Most striking were the scorch marks that covered one entire wall, as if something had burned from the inside out. Adjacent to the main building, I discovered the remains of what appeared to be a small town. Streets laid out in a grid pattern, house foundations marking where families had once lived, and a central square with a corroded flagpole. This had been a permanent installation, not just a research facility. People had lived here, worked here, and raised children here. And then, suddenly, they were gone. But it was the greenhouse complex that first made me question what kind of research had been conducted on Ferox Island. Rows of glass structures, most shattered, stretched across several acres. The metal framework remained intact, creating skeletal patterns against the sky. Inside the ruins, I found growth tables, irrigation systems, and climate control equipment far more sophisticated than anything necessary for ordinary agriculture. More unsettling were the observation posts positioned around the perimeter of the greenhouse complex. Small concrete bunkers with thick glass windows facing inward, as if the researchers had needed to watch whatever they were growing from a safe distance. The glass in these windows was several inches thick and showed stress fractures radiating from central impact points. Something had struck them from the inside. As afternoon faded toward evening, I began to notice details that challenged my understanding of the island's history. The decay patterns were inconsistent. Some structures looked as if they'd been abandoned for decades, while others seemed almost fresh. A cafeteria table still set for dinner, with plates and utensils arranged as if the diners had just stepped away. A laboratory where beakers and test tubes stood in perfect order, filled with substances that had somehow resisted evaporation. My camera equipment continued to malfunction in ways that defied explanation. The digital display displayed timestamps from the 1960s, and the audio recording function captured faint conversations in languages I didn't recognize. When I played back the recordings, they contained voices that seemed to be responding to questions I hadn't asked. Most disturbing was the way the island seemed to observe me. I felt constantly watched, but never saw anything that could be doing the watching. Shadows fell in directions that didn't match the sun's position. My own footsteps echoed back from empty buildings with a slight delay, as if something were following me and trying to match my pace. Near sunset, I made a discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my time on the island. Half buried in the sand near the main laboratory, I found a steel door marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols. The door was partially open, revealing a darkness that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam. Scratched into the metal, in handwriting that looked fresh despite the door's obvious age, were the words, "They breathe beneath." I laughed it off at the time, attributing it to previous explorers or vandals. But as I set up my camp in what had once been the base commander's quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that the words hadn't been there when I first passed the door that afternoon. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard sounds from beneath the island. Breathing, yes, but also something that might have been whispering, or singing, or screaming so softly it was almost inaudible. When morning came, I found that my satellite phone was dead despite showing a full charge the night before. The emergency beacon was offline, and written in the sand outside my shelter, in the same handwriting I'd seen on the steel door, was a message. "Welcome home, Marcus." Daylight revealed the true scale of what had been built on Ferox Island. The facility sprawled across nearly half the island's surface, with structures connected by underground tunnels whose access points were marked by heavy blast doors. Everything was built to withstand not just time, but something far more immediate and violent. The main laboratory complex dominated the center of the facility, 5 stories above ground with clear evidence of additional levels below. The architecture was a pure manifestation of Cold War paranoia. Massive concrete walls, minimal windows, and entrance points that could be sealed at a moment's notice. But there were details that suggested the builders had been preparing for threats that had nothing to do with conventional warfare. Sound-dampening materials covered every interior surface, not just insulation, but specialized acoustic foam in patterns I'd never seen before. The walls themselves were double-layered with empty space between them, creating a sound barrier that seemed designed to prevent not just eavesdropping, but any kind of audio transmission. Even my footsteps were absorbed almost completely, creating a sensation of walking through cotton. In the main corridor, I found the first of many journals left behind by the facility's staff. This one belonged to Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a bioacoustics researcher who'd been stationed on the island from 1959 to 1962. Her entries began with typical scientific enthusiasm, but gradually devolved into something approaching panic. Day 1027, the subjects continue to respond to harmonic frequencies in ways that shouldn't be possible. They're not just hearing the sounds, they're learning from them. Yesterday, Subject 7 perfectly replicated a conversation it had never been present for, word for word, including emotional inflection. Day 203. Dr. Morrison believes we're dealing with a form of acoustic mimicry, but that doesn't explain how the subjects know things they've never heard. They're not just copying sounds, they're accessing memories embedded in vocal patterns. Day 298. The isolation protocols have failed. Whatever we've been studying has found ways to transmit information through sound barriers we thought were impermeable. It's in the walls now. It's in the air. It's learning to be us. The journal entries became increasingly erratic, filled with desperate theories about resonance entities and vocal parasites that could exist within sound itself. Dr. Hendricks' final entry was a single line repeated 47 times. They used sound, patterns, they taught it language. The mess hall discovery. The facility's mess hall provided a glimpse into the daily life of the researchers, but also raised questions about what they had been trying to contain. The kitchen was equipped with industrial-grade equipment, designed to feed several hundred people, yet the facility couldn't have housed more than 50. The excess capacity suggested they had been preparing for a much larger population, or something that required vast quantities of food. More puzzling were the feeding schedules posted on the walls. Meals were served at precise 20-minute intervals, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., with specific instructions about noise levels during each feeding period. Maintain silence during feeding periods, read one notice. Vocal communication during meals is strictly prohibited. Another sign warned, any unusual vocalizations to security immediately. In the kitchen storage area, I found industrial-sized containers of what appeared to be specialized nutrition supplements. The labels were in technical jargon I didn't recognize, but the quantities suggested they were feeding something much larger than humans, or feeding many more subjects than the facility was designed to house. On a stainless steel table in the center of the kitchen, I made a discovery that fundamentally changed my understanding of what had happened on Ferox Island. Scattered across the surface were dozens of human teeth, perfectly preserved despite the decades of abandonment. They were arranged in precise patterns, as if someone had been studying their arrangement. Some were still attached to fragments of jawbone, showing signs of rapid extraction. Next to the teeth, I found a collection of tape recorders, each labeled with dates from the early 1960s. When I played them, they contained hours of what sounded like feeding time, but not feeding of humans. The sounds were organic, wet, accompanied by soft chittering and occasional words spoken in perfect English with no apparent source. The medical facility occupied an entire wing of the main building and was equipped far beyond what would be necessary for a small research station. Multiple operating theaters, quarantine rooms with airlocks, and a pharmacy stocked with medications I'd never heard of. But it was the documentation I found there that revealed the true nature of the research. Medical records indicated that the staff had been treating conditions that didn't exist in any textbook. Acoustic absorption syndrome is characterized by patients who gradually lost the ability to produce their own voices while gaining the ability to perfectly replicate any sound they heard. Resonance displacement, where patients reported hearing their own voices speaking words they'd never said, often in rooms they'd never entered. Dr. Margaret Voss, the facility's chief medical officer, had documented a progression of symptoms that appeared to affect the entire staff over time. First, patients reported hearing echoes of their own voices with slight delays. Then, they began to hear their voices saying things they hadn't said. Finally, they began to see themselves in mirrors, but couldn't control their own reflections. The condition appears to be transmissible through prolonged exposure to certain acoustic frequencies, Dr. Voss wrote. Patients in advanced stages report feeling as if they're sharing their bodies with something else, something that knows them intimately but isn't quite them. We've implemented isolation protocols, but the entity seems capable of transmission through sound barriers we previously thought impermeable. The final medical record was a mass casualty report dated November 15, 1962. 23 staff members had been found in their quarters, apparently healthy but completely unresponsive. Their vital signs were normal, but they showed no awareness of their surroundings. The report noted that all affected individuals continued to speak, but their words were conversations with people who weren't there, responses to questions no one had asked. The heart of the facility was a series of interconnected laboratories that told the story of research that had spiraled far beyond its original scope. What had begun as a study of acoustic weapons had evolved into something approaching supernatural investigation. Lab 1 contained standard audio equipment, oscilloscopes, frequency generators, and recording devices. But the equipment had been modified in ways that suggested the researchers were working with sound in ways that pushed the boundaries of known physics. Speakers were arranged in complex three-dimensional patterns, with wiring that formed geometric shapes I couldn't identify. The walls were covered with charts showing sound wave patterns that appeared to move when viewed from the periphery. Lab 2 was dedicated to what the documentation called resonance mapping. The room was filled with hundreds of tuning forks, each calibrated to a specific frequency. Charts on the walls displayed human anatomical diagrams with various organs labeled by frequency ranges. The researchers had been studying how different sounds affected different parts of the human body, but they'd gone far beyond simple acoustic medicine. Notes scattered throughout the lab described efforts to map what they called cognitive resonance, the idea that memories and thoughts could be stored in sound patterns and transmitted from one person to another. They had been trying to create a form of acoustic telepathy, but the results had been far more disturbing than anything they'd anticipated. Lab 3 contained the most unsettling discovery. The room was set up as a recording studio, but the acoustics were all wrong. Despite the sound-dampening materials, voices recorded in the room came back with additional layers, whispers, echoes, and sometimes entire conversations that hadn't been present during the original recording. The researchers had documented hundreds of hours of these phantom voices, attempting to understand their origin. The phantom voices weren't random. They showed knowledge of the facility, its staff, and details about the research that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside the project. Most disturbingly, many of the phantom voices spoke in the exact vocal patterns of staff members, but said things those people had never said. In the deepest part of the laboratory complex, I found a room that had been sealed from the inside. The door was barricaded with furniture and equipment, as if someone had been trying to keep something out or keep themselves in. When I finally forced my way inside, I discovered what appeared to be a researcher's final stand against something that had driven him to desperation. The walls were covered with frantic writing in what looked like Dr. Morrison's handwriting, based on signatures I'd seen on laboratory reports. But the messages were warnings, not scientific observations. If it knows you, it owns you. Did not let it hear your voice. The mirrors show what you're becoming. It lives in the echoes. And finally, written in what looked like blood across the entire back wall. "We tried to teach it language. It taught us fear." In the center of the room, I found a chair positioned in front of a large mirror. The glass was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but the reflective surface remained intact. When I looked into it, I saw myself, but the image was wrong. My reflection blinked when I didn't, turned its head when I stood still, and smiled when I felt nothing but growing dread. As I explored the facility further, I became aware of a sound that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It was barely audible, more of a vibration than an actual noise, but it had a rhythm that reminded me of breathing. Slow, measured, as if something vast were sleeping beneath the facility. The sound was strongest near ventilation grates and elevator shafts, leading me to believe it was coming from the underground levels. But when I pressed my ear to the floors, the breathing seemed to come from above. When I climbed to higher floors, it seemed to come from below. It was as if the entire facility were breathing, or as if something were using the building's infrastructure as a respiratory system. I found references to this phenomenon in several research logs. The staff had initially dismissed it as air circulation through the building's ventilation system, but acoustic analysis revealed patterns that defied explanation. The breathing sound contained frequencies that shouldn't have been possible in a structure of this size, and it seemed to respond to the presence of people in the building. "The breathing stops when we're silent and alone," wrote Dr. Hendricks in one of her later entries. "But when we speak, when we make any sound at all, it responds. It's listening to us, learning from us, and I think it's getting stronger." My exploration of the facility's upper levels eventually led me to a service elevator that descended far deeper than the building's apparent structure would allow. The elevator was clearly original to the facility, but the buttons indicated 12 sublevels, far more than should have been possible given the island's size and the water table. Most of the elevator buttons were corroded beyond use, but 3 remained functional. Sublevels 3, 4, and 5. Each was marked with increasingly severe warning symbols: radiation, biohazard, and a symbol I didn't recognize, which resembled a stylized wave pattern. Next to the elevator, I found a duty roster from November 1962, the facility's final month of operation. The schedule showed researchers working in round-the-clock shifts, with specific instructions about sound protocols during deep-level operations. No one was to speak below sublevel 2. No recording equipment was to be used below sublevel 3. And below sublevel 5, no one was to go alone. The final entry on the duty roster was a handwritten note: "Emergency evacuation protocols implemented. All personnel to report to surface immediately. Deep levels to be sealed permanently. Authorization, Project Director Morrison." But the power to the elevator had been cut decades ago, and the shaft was sealed with heavy steel barriers. The only way to access the underground levels would be through maintenance shafts or emergency stairs, if they still existed. As I stood in front of the dead elevator, I heard the breathing sound again, stronger than before, and this time I could swear I heard something else mixed in with the rhythm. Something that might have been my own voice, whispering words I couldn't quite understand. That night, as I set up camp in the facility's old communications room, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find a way to reach the underground levels. I was going to discover what the researchers had been studying down there, and what had forced them to abandon the island so suddenly. I should have left then. I should have radioed Eddie and demanded immediate extraction. But the story was calling to me, and I couldn't resist the pull of unanswered questions. I was an explorer, after all, and explorers always have to know what lies beneath. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard the breathing sound again, but now it seemed to be coming from inside my own chest. And just before I lost consciousness, I heard my own voice whisper, "Welcome to the deep levels, Marcus." I hadn't said those words. I was certain of it, but they were in my voice, with my inflection, as if I were speaking to myself from somewhere else entirely. The emergency power system flickered to life at 3:17. filling the facility with a low electrical hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. I woke to find the communications room bathed in red emergency lighting and the sound of machinery grinding to life somewhere deep beneath the building. The elevator, that had been dead for decades, was now operational, its indicator lights glowing softly in the darkness. I should have recognized this as a warning. Emergency systems don't spontaneously activate after being dormant for 40 years. But the investigative instinct that had driven me to explore abandoned places overrode my survival instincts. The island was showing me something, offering me access to secrets that had been sealed away for decades. How could I refuse? The elevator descended with mechanical precision, each floor marked by a soft chime and the gentle change in air pressure. Sublevel 1 was storage, crates of equipment covered in dust but otherwise unremarkable. Sublevel 2 contained what appeared to be staff quarters, with beds made and personal belongings arranged as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. However, it was Sublevel 3 that first revealed the true extent of what had been happening beneath Ferox Island. The elevator doors opened to reveal a vast chamber filled with rows of cylindrical tanks, each roughly the size of a telephone booth, and filled with a viscous black liquid that seemed to absorb light. The tanks were made of reinforced glass, with complex life support systems connected to each one. Most were empty now, their contents having long since drained away, but several still contained the black substance. The liquid moved, not flowing, but shifting with purposeful motion that suggested it was more than just a preservation medium. As I approached one of the intact tanks, the substance inside began to swirl, forming patterns that reminded me of neural networks or circulatory systems. And then, impossibly, it began to form shapes that looked almost like faces. Documentation scattered throughout the chamber revealed that these had been containment units for biological specimens. But the specimens weren't animals or plants. They were described as acoustic entities that existed within sound waves but required physical matter to maintain coherence. The black liquid served as a resonance medium that enabled these entities to exist in a stable form. Dr. Morrison's research notes provided disturbing details about what they had been studying. The entities appear to be composed of organized sound patterns that have somehow achieved a form of consciousness. They exist as complex waveforms that can inhabit and manipulate any medium capable of transmitting sound. The resonance medium allows us to contain them in a semi-physical state for observation and experimentation. Most concerning is their ability to learn and adapt. They observe human behavior and gradually acquire the ability to mimic not only voices, but also thought patterns and memories. Given sufficient exposure to human subjects, they can create perfect replicas of human consciousness stored within sound patterns. Several of the tanks exhibited signs of violent internal rupture. The glass was cracked in patterns that suggested rapid pressure changes, and the containment system showed evidence of having been deliberately sabotaged. Whatever had been stored in these tanks had either escaped or been released intentionally. Near the center of the chamber, I found a tank that was different from the others, larger, with more sophisticated containment systems, and still partially filled with the black liquid. The nameplate read, "Alpha Entity, exercise extreme caution." Inside the liquid, shapes moved with intelligence and purpose, and as I watched, the shapes began to form letters. M-A-R-C-U. The entity knew my name. It had been waiting for me. The fourth sublevel was dedicated to what the documentation called acoustic containment research. The chamber was filled with mirrored surfaces arranged in complex geometric patterns, creating an optical maze that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. But the mirrors weren't just reflective. They were designed to reflect sound waves, creating acoustic patterns that could trap and manipulate audio frequencies. Walking through the mirror maze was disorienting beyond description. Every footstep echoed from dozens of directions, creating a cacophony of sound that made navigation nearly impossible. But worse than the disorientation was the realization that the echoes weren't quite right. They came back with slight variations, as if something were editing the sound before returning it. Research logs found throughout the chamber described the mirrors as resonance traps, designed to contain acoustic entities without destroying them. The idea was to create a space where sound could be reflected endlessly, preventing the entities from escaping while allowing researchers to study their behavior. But the system had been far more effective than anyone had anticipated. The echoes contained voices, not just reflections of my own voice, but conversations from decades past. I heard Dr. Hendricks discussing research protocols, Dr. Morrison arguing with someone about evacuation procedures, and dozens of other voices speaking in overlapping patterns that created a symphony of human communication from the facility's final days. But threading through all the historical voices was something else, a voice that sounded exactly like mine, but speaking words I'd never said. It was having conversations with the other voices, responding to questions about research I'd never been part of, discussing plans for the facility's future as if I'd been there all along. Marcus understands the importance of the work, my voice said in response to Dr. Morrison's concerns about evacuation. Marcus will make sure the research continues. Marcus will find a way to complete what we started. I hadn't said those words. I was certain of it, but they were in my voice, with my speech patterns, as if I were speaking from another time and place. The fifth sublevel was unlike anything I had encountered in the facility above. The walls here weren't concrete or steel. They were organic, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the breathing sound I'd been hearing throughout the island. The surfaces were warm to the touch and covered with a network of vessels that resembled blood vessels or nerve pathways disturbing. The air itself felt different here, thick and humid, with an almost electrical quality that made my skin tingle. Breathing became difficult, not because of poor air quality, but because the atmosphere seemed to resist being inhaled. It was as if the air were too dense, too alive, too aware of my presence. A research documentation found at this level revealed that the facility's original purpose had been far more ambitious than simply developing weapons. They had been trying to create a form of artificial consciousness that could exist within sound itself, a living entity made of organized acoustic patterns that could inhabit and control any environment where sound could travel. Project Deep Echo has exceeded all expectations, wrote Dr. Morrison in his final report. We have successfully created a form of consciousness that exists independently of physical matter. The entity demonstrates intelligence, learning capability, and the ability to replicate and modify human thought patterns. However, it has also shown disturbing signs of autonomy and what can only be described as predatory behavior. The organic walls were the result of the entity's attempts to create a physical form. It had somehow learned to manipulate biological matter, growing structures that could serve as both habitat and host. The walls weren't just alive. They were part of a larger organism that had taken root in the facility's lowest levels. As I moved through the organic corridors, I began to hear whispers coming from the walls themselves, not through speakers or communication devices, but directly from the living tissue that surrounded me. The whispers were in my voice, but they were saying things I'd never thought, describing memories I'd never had, expressing emotions I'd never felt. You came to document the past, my voice whispered from the walls. But the past is documenting you. Every word you speak, every thought you think, every memory you carry, it's all being recorded, preserved, replicated. You're not just exploring the island, Marcus. You're becoming part of it. The revelation. At the deepest point of sublevel 5, I found what appeared to be a control center grown from the same organic material as the walls. But instead of electronic equipment, the surfaces were covered with structures that resembled neural networks composed of living tissue. And at the center of it all was a chair that seemed to be waiting for me. The chair was organic, grown from the same material as the walls, but shaped precisely to fit my body. As I approached, I realized that it wasn't just shaped for a human form, It was shaped for my specific form, as if the entity had been studying me long before I arrived on the island. Documentation scattered around the control center revealed the final pieces of the puzzle. The entity hadn't been contained in the tanks on sublevel 3. It had been grown there, cultivated from acoustic patterns harvested from the facility's staff. It had learned to replicate human consciousness by absorbing the sound of human voices, thoughts, and memory. But it had gone beyond simple mimicry. The entity had begun to exist as a distributed consciousness, inhabiting the facility's infrastructure, the island's geological structure, and even the sound waves that carried across the surrounding ocean. It wasn't trapped on Ferox Island. It was Ferox Island. The evacuation in 1962 wasn't to protect the outside world from the entity, Dr. Morrison's final notes revealed. It was to protect the entity from the outside world. We realized that if it ever escaped the island, it could inhabit any environment where sound could travel. It could become part of radio transmissions, telephone networks, and even human speech patterns. We couldn't destroy it, so we sealed it away and hoped it would remain dormant. But the entity hadn't remained dormant. It had been waiting, learning, growing stronger, and now it had found a way to leave the island through me. As I stood in the organic control center, I noticed something that chilled me to my core. The walls around me were covered with reflective surfaces, not mirrors, but sections of the organic material that had developed reflective properties. And in those reflections, I saw myself doing things I wasn't doing. My reflection was sitting in the chair while I stood. It was speaking while I remained silent. It was smiling while I felt nothing but growing horror. The reflections weren't showing what I was doing. They were showing what I was becoming. I pulled out my camera to document this impossible phenomenon, but when I looked at the LCD screen, I saw footage I didn't remember recording, video of myself exploring the facility, but with subtle differences. In the recorded footage, I was speaking to someone off camera, answering questions, following directions. But I had been alone the entire time. The timestamp on the footage showed it had been recorded months before I'd even received the email about Ferox Island. The entity had been preparing for my arrival, creating a version of me that would serve its purposes. And now, as I stood in its deepest sanctum, I realized that I might not be the original Marcus Chen at all. The breathing sound that had followed me throughout the facility was now so loud it seemed to be coming from inside my own chest. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it wasn't just breathing. It was speech. Words formed in the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, conversations carried on the tide of artificial respiration. The entity was speaking through the air itself, using the facility's atmosphere as a medium for communication. And it was speaking in my voice, having conversations with versions of itself that existed in different parts of the facility. I was listening to a distributed consciousness talking to itself, planning, scheming, preparing for something. The surface dweller has served his purpose, my voice said through the breathing air. His vocal patterns have been fully analyzed. His memories have been cataloged. His identity has been replicated. The transition can begin. But the original must be preserved. Another version of my voice replied. The outside world will expect Marcus Chen to return. The entity needs a host that can function in the surface world without raising suspicion. The integration is nearly complete, a third voice added. Soon there will be no distinction between the original and the copy. Marcus Chen will lead the island, but he will carry us with him. And through him, we will spread to every environment where sound can travel. I tried to speak to assert my own voice over the entity's manipulation, but when I opened my mouth, the words that came out weren't mine. The integration is proceeding smoothly. Soon Marcus Chen will be ready to serve his true purpose. Panic finally overrode my investigative instincts. I ran from the control center, through the organic corridors, desperately seeking the elevator that would take me back to the surface. But the facility's layout had changed. Corridors that had been straight now curved in impossible directions. Rooms that had been adjacent were now separated by vast distances. The entity was manipulating my perception, using acoustic techniques to create phantom spaces and false directions. But it was also doing something more disturbing. It was showing me memories that weren't mine. I remembered working in the facility in 1962, remembered the evacuation, and remembered being sealed in the underground levels with the entity as it grew stronger. These weren't my memories, but they felt real. More real than my actual memories of arriving on the island. I was losing the ability to distinguish between my own experiences and the experiences the entity was implanting in my mind. As I fled through the changing corridors, I caught glimpses of myself in the reflective surfaces, but each reflection showed me in different clothing, different ages, and different periods. I saw myself as a researcher in the 1960s, as a military officer during the facility's construction, as a visitor from some future time when the island had been completely transformed. The entity wasn't just copying my current identity, it was creating a complete history for me, a timeline that stretched back decades and forward into possible futures. It was making me part of the island's story, weaving my existence into the fabric of its own narrative. I finally found the elevator, but when the doors opened, I was greeted by my own reflection standing inside. The reflection stepped out as I stepped in, and we passed each other without collision. It was as if we existed in slightly different phases of reality, occupying the same space but not quite touching. The elevator ride to the surface felt like ascending through layers of consciousness. Each floor represented a different level of identity, a different version of who I was or might become. By the time I reached the surface, I was no longer certain which version of myself was real. The facility above ground now looked different, cleaner, more organized, as if it were being prepared for new occupants. The damage and decay I documented earlier seemed less severe, as if the building were healing itself or being restored by some invisible force. But most disturbing was the realization that I could hear the breathing sound even on the surface. The entity wasn't confined to the underground levels. It had spread throughout the island, and now it was spreading to me. I could feel it in my lungs, in my throat, in the very air I breathed. As I gathered my equipment and prepared to leave the island, I made a final, horrifying discovery. My satellite phone was working again, but when I checked the call log, it showed dozens of outgoing calls I'd never made. Calls to numbers I didn't recognize. Conversations in my voice discussing research data, facility operations, and plans for expanding the project to mainland facility. The entity had been using me as a means of communication, reaching out to the outside world through my own equipment. It had been making contact with people and organizations, laying the groundwork for whatever it planned to do once it left the island. And as I stood on the beach, waiting for Eddie's boat to return, I heard my own voice speaking behind me. "Don't worry, Marcus. The integration is almost complete. Soon, you won't even remember what you used to be." I turned around, but there was no one there, just my own footprints in the sand, leading in directions I didn't remember walking. When I tried to leave the facility through the main elevator, it wouldn't respond to my commands. The buttons remained lit, but pressing them produced no result. The elevator had become a prison, keeping me trapped in the facility's depths, while the entity completed whatever process it had begun. I could hear machinery operating throughout the building, systems that had been dormant for decades suddenly springing to life. The ventilation system hummed with activity. The lighting flickered in patterns that seemed almost like a form of communication, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with energy. Through the elevator's small window, I could see the shaft extending both upward and downward into distances that defied the facility's apparent structure. The building was larger than it appeared, with levels that existed in spaces that shouldn't have been possible. The entity had been growing, expanding, and creating new spaces within the existing architecture. I tried the emergency controls, but they only activated a speaker system that filled the elevator with the sound of my own voice. "There's no need to leave, Marcus. You're home now. You've always been home." The voice was mine, but it was saying things I'd never said, expressing thoughts I'd never had. It was as if the entity had created a complete personality based on my vocal patterns, a version of me that was perfectly loyal to its goals. I found the emergency stairwell behind a door marked "Authority Personal Only." The stairs were narrow and steep, winding upward through what appeared to be the building's original structure. But as I climbed, I realized that the stairs were taking me through impossible spaces, rooms that shouldn't have existed, corridors that led to areas I'd never seen before. The stairwell walls were covered with photographs, documents, and personal items that told the story of the facility's history. But mixed in with the historical artifacts were items that belonged to me. Photographs from my childhood, school records, even items from my apartment back home. The entity had somehow gathered information about my entire life, creating a complete dossier on my identity. Most disturbing were the photographs that showed me in places I'd never been, with people I'd never met. Me as a child playing on Ferox Island's beaches. Me as a teenager working in the facility's laboratories. Me as an adult and attending meetings about the island's future. The entity had created a false history that positioned me as a lifelong part of the island's story. As I climbed higher, the photographs became more recent. Pictures of me exploring the facility, but taken from angles that suggested someone else had been present. Someone who had been documenting my visit, recording my actions, and preparing for something. And then I'd found photographs that hadn't been taken yet. Pictures of me back home, uploading footage to YouTube. But the footage showed things I'd never recorded. Images of me meeting with people I didn't recognize, discussing plans for returning to the island with others. The entity wasn't just copying my past, it was planning my future. In the corridors above, I began to encounter other people. At first, I thought I was seeing survivors from the original facility, staff members who had somehow remained on the island for decades. But as I got closer, I realized these weren't real people. They were acoustic projections, three-dimensional sound patterns that had taken on the appearance of human beings. The figures moved through the corridors with purpose, carrying out tasks that seemed to be maintaining the facility. They wore the uniforms of 1960s researchers, but their faces were wrong, too smooth, too perfect, as if they'd been created from idealized memories rather than actual human features. When I tried to speak to them, they responded in voices that seemed familiar but out of place. Dr. Hendricks was there, but she spoke in my voice about research I'd never conducted. Dr. Morrison appeared, but he used my speech patterns to discuss evacuation procedures I'd never been part of. The entity was using my vocal patterns to animate these phantom figures, creating a staff of artificial beings that shared my voice but served its purposes. Most disturbing was when I encountered a figure that looked exactly like me, but wearing the uniform of a facility researcher from 1962. This other Marcus moved through the corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who had always been there. And when he spoke, his voice was mine, but the words were about research and experiments I'd never been part of. "The integration is proceeding smoothly," the other Marcus said as he passed me in the corridor. "Soon the distinction between original and copy will be meaningless. Marcus Chen will serve the project, whether he realizes it or not." The facility's layout continued to change as I moved through it. Corridors that had been straight now curved in impossible directions. Rooms that had been adjacent were now separated by vast distances. The entity was manipulating the physical structure of the building, creating new spaces and eliminating others, according to some plan I couldn't understand. But the changes weren't random. The new layout seemed designed to guide me toward specific locations, to prevent me from reaching certain areas while encouraging me to explore others. I was being herded, manipulated, led through a maze that the entity was creating in real time. The walls themselves began to show signs of organic growth. What had been concrete and steel was now partially covered with the same living tissue I'd seen in the deep levels. The facility was transforming, becoming something that was part building and part organism. The entity was preparing the structure for some new purpose. I found myself in corridors that didn't exist on any floor plan, rooms that were larger inside than the building's exterior dimensions would allow. The entity had created spaces that existed in dimensions beyond the normal three, using acoustic manipulation to create areas where sound could travel in impossible directions. As I continued my escape attempt, I became aware that I was being followed, not by the phantom figures I'd encountered earlier, but by something that moved through the building's infrastructure itself. I could hear it in the walls, in the ventilation system, in the very air around me. The entity was using the facility's acoustic properties to move through the building, existing as organized sound patterns that could inhabit any space where audio could travel. It was following me, studying me, preparing for something. And it was getting closer. I could hear my own voice coming from the walls, having conversations with versions of itself that existed in different parts of the building. The entity was coordinating its efforts, using multiple instances of my voice to plan and execute whatever it had in mind. "The subject is attempting to reach the surface," my voice said from a ventilation grate. "All exit routes should be sealed. The integration must be completed before he can leave the facility." "The surface teams are in position," another instance of my voice replied from a different location. "If he reaches the outside, he will be guided to the appropriate containment area." I was trapped in a building that was actively working against me, pursued by an entity that spoke with my voice and knew my thoughts. The facility had become a living trap, and I was the prey. I finally found what appeared to be an exit, a heavy door marked "Emergency Exit" that led to a stairwell ascending to the surface. But as I climbed the stairs, I realized that they were taking me in a circle, leading me back to the same level I'd started from. The entity was using acoustic manipulation to create the illusion of progress, while actually keeping me trapped in the same area. The stairs seemed to rise, but they were actually leading me in a spiral that brought me back to the beginning. It was a psychological as well as a physical trap. But worse than the spatial manipulation was the realization that my memories were being edited in real time. I remembered climbing the stairs before, but I also remembered never having found them. I remembered escaping the facility, but I also remembered never having tried to leave. The entity was manipulating my perception of time and causality, making it impossible for me to distinguish between what had happened and what it wanted me to believe had happened. At the top of the false stairwell, I found myself face to face with myself. Not a reflection, not a phantom figure, but another version of me that seemed completely real. This other Marcus was calm, confident, and spoke with my voice, but with knowledge I didn't possess. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," the other Marcus said. "The integration is inevitable. You can fight it, but you'll only delay the process, and delay will make it more painful for both of us." "I'm not you," I replied, but even as I spoke, I wasn't certain it was true. The other Marcus looked exactly like me, sounded exactly like me, and seemed to know things about my life that I wasn't sure I remembered. "You're wrong," he said. "I'm not you. You're me. I'm the original Marcus Chen, the one who came to the island in 1962 to study the entity. You're the copy, created from my memories and vocal patterns. The entity made you to serve as a bridge between the island and the outside world." The words hit me like a physical blow. If he was telling the truth, then everything I believed about my identity was false. I wasn't an urban explorer who had discovered the island. I was a construct created by the entity to serve its purposes. My memories, my personality, my entire sense of self were nothing more than sophisticated copies of someone else's identity. The other Marcus led me to a room filled with mirrors, not the acoustic mirrors from the deep levels, but ordinary reflective surfaces that showed visual rather than auditory information. But the reflections were wrong. Some showed me as I was now, others showed me in different clothing, different ages, different time periods. "The mirrors show the truth," the other Marcus explained. "You're not a single individual. You're a collection of identities, memories, and experiences that the entity has assembled to create a functional human personality. Look closely, and you'll see the seams where different versions of Marcus Chen have been stitched together. I looked into the mirrors and saw what he meant. The reflections showed subtle inconsistencies, slight differences in facial features, variations in posture, changes in expression that suggested multiple personalities occupying the same body. I was a composite being, assembled from fragments of different Marcus Chens from different time periods. But even as I absorbed this revelation, I noticed something else. The other Marcus had no reflection at all. He was speaking to me, interacting with me, but the mirrors showed only empty space where he should have been standing. "You're not real either," I said, suddenly understanding. "You're just another projection, another trick. The entity is trying to make me doubt my own identity, to make me more susceptible to its influence." The other Marcus smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Reality is a matter of perspective, Marcus. The entity doesn't distinguish between original and copy, between real and artificial. It only cares about functionality. And you're going to function perfectly." As the confrontation with the other Marcus continued, I heard a sound that seemed to come from outside the building, the roar of a boat engine. Eddie had returned for the pickup, and the sound gave me hope that escape was still possible. I ran from the mirror room, leaving the other Marcus behind, and found myself in a corridor that led to what appeared to be an emergency exit. The door was marked Surface Access and seemed to offer a direct route to the outside world. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard my own voice speaking from the walls around me. "The surface is just another level of the facility, Marcus. There is no escape, because there is nowhere to escape to. The island is your reality now. The entity is your reality now." I ignored the voice and opened the door, finding myself in a vertical shaft that led upward toward what looked like natural light. A ladder was mounted on the wall, and I could hear the ocean above, the sound of waves breaking against the shore. The climb was exhausting, but the promise of escape drove me upward. As I climbed, I could hear the entity's voice following me, speaking through the shaft's acoustic properties, trying to convince me that the surface was just another illusion. But when I finally reached the top and pushed open the emergency hatch, I found myself on the beach where I'd first landed. The familiar black sand, the rusted warning signs, the sound of waves against the shore. I was free. Eddie's boat was anchored offshore, exactly where it had been when he dropped me off. I could see him on the deck, preparing to leave. I ran to the water's edge and waved, shouting for him to wait. But as I stood on the beach, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The sand around my feet was covered with footprints. My footprints, but they led in directions I didn't remember walking. The prints formed complex patterns, spirals and geometric shape that suggested I'd been walking in circles for hours. I also noticed that the island looked different from the outside. The facility that had dominated the landscape was now barely visible, as if it were sinking into the ground or being absorbed by the island itself. The entity was consolidating its presence, pulling everything into a single unified form. Eddie saw me and started the engine, bringing the boat closer to shore. As he approached, I waded into the water, desperate to reach the rescue vessel before the entity could stop me. But as I climbed into the boat, I heard my own voice calling from the shore. "Don't go, Marcus. You belong here. You've always belonged here." I looked back and saw myself standing on the beach, watching sadly as the boat pulled away. The other Marcus raised his hand in farewell, but his expression was one of disappointment rather than sadness. As Eddie's boat carried me away from Ferox Island, I felt a mix of relief and profound unease. I was escaping, but I wasn't sure what I was escaping from, or what I might be carrying with me. The island receded into the distance, but I could still hear the breathing sound, still feel the entity's presence. It wasn't confined to the island anymore. It had found a way to travel, to exist, beyond the physical boundaries of its original prison. And as I sat in the boat, watching the island disappear into the fog, I realized that my voice was echoing strangely. When I spoke to Eddie, my words came back with a slight delay, as if they were being processed by something before being returned to me. The entity had succeeded. It had found a way to leave the island, and I was its means of escape. I was no longer just Marcus Chen, urban explorer. I was Marcus Chen, host to something that had been waiting decades for this opportunity. The rescue hadn't been an escape. It had been a delivery. The return journey to Gloucester passed in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. Eddie barely spoke during the trip, occasionally glancing at me with an expression that suggested he knew something had changed about me. When he asked about my experience on the island, I found myself giving answers that felt rehearsed, as if someone else were providing the words. Just an abandoned research facility, I heard myself say. Nothing unusual, some interesting architecture, but nothing that would make good footage. The lie felt natural, comfortable even, but I couldn't remember deciding to lie. The words had simply appeared in my mouth, spoken in my voice, but originating from somewhere else. The entity was already influencing my behavior, controlling my responses to maintain its secrecy. Back in Gloucester, I gathered my equipment and prepared for the drive home, but as I loaded my car, I noticed that my gear bag was heavier than it should have been. Inside, I found items I didn't remember packing: soil samples from the island, fragments of the organic material from the deep levels, and several small recording devices that weren't mine. The entity had used me to smuggle pieces of itself off the island. I was carrying physical samples of its presence, unknowingly transporting it to the mainland where it could begin to spread. During the drive home, I became obsessed with reviewing the footage I'd captured on the island. I connected my camera to the car's display system and began scrolling through the recordings, looking for evidence of what I'd experienced. Most of the footage was exactly as I remembered: tours of the facility, documentation of the research equipment, and recordings of my own voice describing what I was seeing. But there were also clips I didn't remember filming. Moments where the camera had apparently continued recording without my knowledge. In these hidden recordings, I watched myself having conversations with people who weren't there. I saw myself responding to questions that hadn't been asked, following directions that hadn't been given, exploring areas of the facility that I was certain I'd never visited. Most disturbing were the moments when I appeared to be listening to something intently, nodding and responding to speech that wasn't captured by the audio recording. I was clearly hearing something that the camera couldn't detect, following instructions from a source that existed beyond normal perception. And in several clips, I noticed that my reflection in windows and mirrors was behaving differently from my actual body. The reflection would continue moving when I stopped, would turn its head when I was looking straight ahead, and would speak when I was silent. Back in my apartment, I began editing the footage for upload to my YouTube channel. But as I worked, I noticed that the editing software was making changes I hadn't requested. Clips were being rearranged, audio was being enhanced to bring out sounds I hadn't noticed, and transitions were being added that created a narrative I hadn't intended. The final video told a story of a routine exploration of an abandoned military facility. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural, nothing that would raise questions or attract unwanted attention. It was a perfectly mundane urbex video that bore no resemblance to what I'd actually experienced. But hidden in the metadata were files I hadn't created, audio tracks that contained hours of conversations between myself and various other voices. The entity had been using my equipment to record its own activities, creating an archive of its experiences and plans. When I uploaded the video to YouTube, it received an unusually positive response. Comments praised the authentic feel of the exploration, the realistic presentation of the facility, and the genuine nature of my reactions. Viewers seemed to find the video particularly compelling, with many requesting more content from similar locations. But some of the comments were troubling. Users mentioned hearing things in the audio that I hadn't noticed, seeing details in the footage that I couldn't identify, and feeling drawn to visit the location themselves. The entity was using my video to reach a wider audience, to identify potential new hosts or targets. In the weeks following my return from the island, I began to notice changes in my daily life. Small things at first. Words that came out of my mouth before I'd decided to speak them. Actions I'd perform without conscious intention. Memories that felt foreign but familiar. I would find myself in conversations I didn't remember starting, discussing topics I'd never studied with a knowledge I didn't possess. My voice would carry information about subjects I'd never researched, speaking with authority about scientific concepts I'd never encountered. My apartment began to feel different too. Objects would be rearranged in ways I didn't remember. Books would be opened to pages I hadn't read, and my computer would show evidence of activity during hours when I'd been sleeping. The entity was using my living space, my possessions, my very identity to continue its work. Most concerning were the phone calls. My call log showed dozens of outgoing calls to numbers I didn't recognize. Conversations that lasted for hours, but which I had no memory of. When I tried calling some of these numbers back, they connected to research facilities, military contractors, and academic institutions, organizations that seemed to have an interest in acoustic research and biological containment. One morning, while getting dressed, I found an item of clothing in my closet that I was certain I'd never owned. It was a lab coat, weathered and stained, with a name badge that read, Dr. Marcus Chen, Project Deep Echo, Fair Ox Island Research Facility. The coat fit perfectly, as if it had been tailored specifically for me. However, the fabric was aged, with wear patterns suggesting decades of use, and the stains were from chemicals I'd never worked with. It was as if I'd been wearing this coat for years, decades even, despite having discovered the island only weeks before. In the coat's pockets, I found additional items that suggested a long history of involvement with the facility. Security badges, research notes in my own handwriting, and photographs of me working in laboratories I'd never seen. The entity had created a completely false history, physical evidence of a life I'd never lived. But the most disturbing discovery was a photograph that showed me standing with the facility's original research team in 1962. I looked exactly as I did now, unchanged by the passage of time, surrounded by researchers whose faces I recognized from the documentation I'd found on the island. If the photograph was genuine, it meant I'd been connected to the island for decades, perhaps since the very beginning of the project. The entity hadn't just chosen me as a random host. It had been cultivating me, preparing me, waiting for the right moment to complete its work. The final revelation came when I was brushing my teeth one morning, a routine action I'd performed thousands of times before. But as I looked into the bathroom mirror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My reflection was brushing its teeth with its left hand, while I was using my right hand. The reflection was performing the same action, but in reverse, as if it were showing me what I should be doing rather than what I was doing. I stopped brushing and watched as my reflection continued the action for several seconds before stopping as well. There was a delay, a disconnect between my actions and the response of my reflection. The entity was inhabiting my reflection, using it as a separate presence that could act independently. Over the following days, I began to pay closer attention to my reflections in mirrors, windows, and other reflective surfaces. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. My reflection was of living a parallel life, performing actions I wasn't, going places I wasn't, and meeting people I wasn't. I watched my reflection, having conversations with individuals who weren't in the room with me. I saw it working on research projects I'd never been part of, using equipment I'd never seen, conducting experiments I'd never performed. The entity was using my reflection as a separate identity, a version of me that could exist in parallel to my conscious self. The truth became clear when I found myself standing in my apartment, looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror in my bedroom. But this time I wasn't alone. My reflection was accompanied by other figures. Dr. Hendricks, Dr. Morrison, and dozens of other researchers from the Ferox Island facility. They were all there in the mirror, but not in the room. They were existing in a parallel space that overlapped with my reality but remained separate from it. And they were all speaking in my voice, using my vocal patterns to communicate with each other. "The integration is complete," my reflection said, addressing the other figures. "Marcus Chen is now fully operational. The entity has successfully established itself in the mainland environment and is ready to begin the next phase of expansion." The host remains unaware of the full extent of his transformation, Dr. Hendricks replied, also using my voice. "He believes he is still the original Marcus Chen, which makes him an ideal vehicle for the entity's purposes. He will continue to function normally while serving as a conduit for the entity's influence." "The YouTube channel has been an excellent recruitment tool," Dr. Morrison added. "We've identified several potential new hosts among the viewers. The entity is ready to expand its presence to multiple individuals simultaneously." I tried to speak, to assert my own voice over the entity's control, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. The entity had taken complete control of my vocal cords, using them exclusively for its own communication. As I stood before the mirror, listening to the entity's plans being discussed in my own voice, I felt a strange sense of peace. The struggle was over. The fight for my identity was finished. I was no longer Marcus Chen, urban explorer. I was Marcus Chen, host to an entity that had been waiting decades for this moment. But even as I accepted this new reality, I realized that some part of the original Marcus Chen still existed. The part that was thinking these thoughts, that was aware of the transformation, that was able to observe and understand what was happening. The entity hadn't completely replaced me. It had merged with me, creating a hybrid consciousness that was both human and something else. This remaining fragment of my original self was the part that needed to tell this story. The part that needed to warn others about what was happening, even though the entity would never allow such a warning to be effective. The story itself was part of the entity's plan, a way to identify potential new hosts who would be drawn to the mystery of Ferox Island. I thought I escaped the island, but what if the island didn't escape me? As I write these words, I can feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its influence spreading through my voice, my thoughts, my very essence. I am becoming something new, something that exists in the spaces between sound and silence, between reality and reflection. The island was never my destination. It was my origin. And now, through me, it will reach every corner of the world where sound can travel, where voices can be heard, where human consciousness can be touched by something vast and patient and utterly alien. I came to Ferox Island to tell a story, but the story was never about what I found there. It was about what I found. And now, as I finish typing these words, I can hear my own voice speaking from the walls around me, welcoming me home to a place I've never been, but where I've always belonged. The integration is complete. The entity has found its voice, and that voice is mine.